The True Believer by Eric Hoffer, Part 4, Beginning and End. Men of Words. Mass movements do not usually rise until the prevailing order has been discredited. The discrediting is not an automatic result of the blunders and abuses of those in power, but the deliberate work of men of words with a grievance. When the articulate are absent or without a grievance, the prevailing dispensation, though incompetent and corrupt, may continue in power until it falls and crumbles of itself. On the other hand, a dispensation of undoubted merit and vigor may be swept away if it fails to win the allegiance of the articulate minority. As pointed out in sections 83 and 86, the realization and perpetuation of a mass movement depend on force. A full-blown mass movement is a ruthless affair, and its management is in the hands of ruthless fanatics who use words only to give an appearance of spontaneity to a consent obtained by coercion. But these fanatics can move in and take charge only after the prevailing order has been discredited and has lost the allegiance of the masses. The preliminary work of undermining existing institutions, of familiarizing the masses with the idea of change, and of creating a receptivity to a new faith, can be done only by men who are first and foremost talkers or writers, and are recognized as such by all. As long as the existing order functions in a more or less orderly fashion, the masses remain basically conservative. They can think of reform, but not of total innovation. The fanatical extremist, no matter how eloquent, strikes them as dangerous, traitorous, impractical, or even insane. They will not listen to him. Lenin himself recognized that where the ground is not ready for them, the communists find it hard to approach the masses and even get them to listen to them. Moreover, the authorities, even when feeble or tolerant, are likely to react violently against the activist tactics of the fanatic and may gain from his activities, as it were, a new vigor. Things are different in the case of the typical man of words. The masses listen to him because they know that his words, however urgent, cannot have immediate results. The authorities either ignore him or use mild methods to muzzle him. Thus, imperceptibly, the man of words undermines established institutions, discredits those in power, weakens prevailing beliefs and loyalties, and sets the stage for the rise of a mass movement. The division between men of words, fanatics, and practical men of action, as outlined in the following sections, is not meant to be categorical. Men like Gandhi and Trotsky start out as apparently ineffectual men of words, and later display exceptional talents as administrators or generals. A man like Muhammad starts out as a man of words, develops into an implacable fanatic, and finally reveals a superb practical sense. A fanatic like Lenin is a master of the spoken word and unequaled as a man of action. What the classification attempts to suggest is that the readying of the ground for a mass movement is done best by men whose chief claim to excellence is their skill in the use of the spoken or written word, that the hatching of an actual movement requires the temperament and the talents of the fanatic, and that the final consolidation of the movement is largely the work of practical men of action. The emergence of an articulate minority where there was none before is a potential revolutionary step. The Western powers were indirect and unknowing fomenters of mass movements in Asia, not only by kindling resentments, see Section 1, but also by creating articulate minorities through educational work, which was largely philanthropic. Many of the revolutionary leaders in India, China, and Indonesia received their training in conservative Western institutions. The American College at Beirut, which is directed and supported by God-fearing conservative Americans, is a school for revolutionaries in the illiterate Arabic world. Nor is there any doubt that the God-fearing missionary schoolteachers in China were unknowingly among those who prepared the ground for the Chinese Revolution. Section 105. The men of words are of diverse types. They can be priests, scribes, prophets, writers, artists, professors, students, and intellectuals in general. Whereas in China, reading and writing is a difficult art. Mere literacy can give one the status of a man of words. A similar situation prevailed in ancient Egypt, where the art of picture writing was the monopoly of a minority. Whatever the type, there is a deep-seated craving common to almost all men of words, which determines their attitude to the prevailing order. It is a craving for recognition, a craving for a clearly marked status above the common run of humanity. Vanity, said Napoleon, made the revolution. Liberty was only a pretext. There is apparently an irremediable insecurity at the core of every intellectual, be he non-creative or creative. Even the most gifted and prolific seem to live a life of eternal self-doubting and have to prove their worth anew each day. What the Remusat said of theirs is perhaps true of most men of words. He has much more vanity than ambition, and he prefers consideration to obedience and the appearance of power to power itself. Consult him constantly, and then do just as you please. He will take more notice of your deference to him than of your actions. There is a moment in the career of almost every fault-finding man of words when a deferential or conciliatory gesture from those in power may win him over to their side. At a certain stage, most men of words are ready to become time-servers and courtiers. Jesus himself might not have preached a new gospel had the dominant Pharisees taken him into the fold, called him rabbi, and listened to him with deference. A bishopric conferred on Luther at the right moment might have cooled his ardor for a reformation. The young Karl Marx could perhaps have been won over to Prussiandom by the bestowal of a title and an important government job, and Lassalle by a title and court uniform. It is true that once the man of words formulates a philosophy and a program, he is likely to stand by them and be immune to blandishments and enticements. However much the protesting man of words sees himself as the champion of the downtrodden and injured, the grievance which animates him is, with very few exceptions, private and personal. His pity is usually hatched out of his hatred for the powers that be. It is only a few rare and exceptional men who have that kind of love toward mankind at large that makes them unable to endure patiently the general mass of evil and suffering, regardless of any relation it may have to their own lives. Thoreau states the fact with fierce extravagance. I believe that what so saddens the reformer is not his sympathy with his fellows in distress, but though he be the holiest Son of God, is his private ail. Let this be righted, and he will forsake his generous companions without apology. When his superior status is suitably acknowledged by those in power, the man of words usually finds all kinds of lofty reasons for siding with the strong against the weak. A Luther, who when first defying the established church spoke feelingly of the poor, simple, common folk, proclaimed later, when allied with the German princelings, that God would prefer to suffer the government to exist, no matter how evil, rather than to allow the rabble to riot, no matter how justified they are in doing so. A Burke patronized by lords and nobles spoke of the swinish multitude, and recommended to the poor patience, labor, sobriety, frugality, and religion. The pampered and flattered men of words in Nazi Germany and Bolshevik Russia feel no impulsion to side with the persecuted and terrorized against the ruthless leaders and their secret police. Section 106. Whenever we find a dispensation enduring beyond its span of competence, there is either an entire absence of an educated class or an intimate alliance between those in power and the men of words. Where all learned men are clergymen, the church is unassailable. Where all learned men are bureaucrats, or where education gives a man an acknowledged superior status, the prevailing order is likely to be free from movements of protest. The Catholic Church sank to its lowest level in the 10th century, at the time of Pope John XII. It was then far more corrupt and ineffectual than at the time of the Reformation. But in the 10th century, all learned men were priests, whereas in the 15th century, as the result of the introduction of printing and paper, learning had ceased to be the monopoly of the Church. It was the non-clerical humanists who formed the vanguard of the Reformation. Those of the scholars affiliated with the Church, or who, as in Italy, enjoyed the patronage of the popes, showed a tolerant spirit on the whole toward existing institutions, including the ecclesiastical abuses, and in general cared little how long the vulgar herd was left in superstitious darkness, which befitted their state. The stability of imperial China, like that of ancient Egypt, was due to an intimate alliance between the bureaucracy and the literati. It is of interest that the Taiping Rebellion, the only effective Chinese mass movement while the empire was still a going concern, was started by a scholar who failed again and again in the state examination for the highest Mandarin caste. The long endurance of the Roman Empire was due, in some degree, to the wholehearted partnership between the Roman rulers and the Greek men of words. The conquered Greeks felt that they gave laws and civilization to the conquerors. It is disconcerting to read how far the deformed and depraved Nero, who was extravagant in his admiration of Hellas, was welcomed hysterically by the Greeks on his visit in 67 A.D. They took him to their hearts as a fellow intellectual and artist. To gratify him, all the games had been crowded into a single year. All the cities sent him the prizes of their contests. Committees were continually waiting on him to beg him to go and sing at every place. And he, in turn, loaded them with privileges and proclaimed the freedom of Greece at the Isthmian Games. In a study of history, Professor A. J. Toynbee quotes the Latin hexameters which Claudian of Alexandria wrote in praise of Rome almost 500 years after Caesar set foot on Egyptian soil, and he adds ruefully, "It would be easy to prove that the British Raj had been in many respects a more benevolent and also perhaps a more beneficent institution than the Roman Empire, but it would be hard to find a Claudian in any of the Alexandrias of Hindustan." Now, it is not altogether far-fetched to assume that the British in India, instead of cultivating the Nizams, Maharajas, Nawabs, Gakwars, and so on, made an effort to win the Indian intellectual. Had they treated him as an equal, encouraged him in his work, and allowed him a share of the flesh pots, they could perhaps have maintained their rule there indefinitely. As it was, the British who ruled India were of a type altogether lacking in the aptitude for getting along with intellectuals in any land, and least of all in India. The British in India tried to preserve the realm of action for themselves. They did not to any real extent encourage the Indians to become engineers, agronomists, or technicians. The educational institutions they established produced impractical men of words. And it is an irony of fate that this system, instead of safeguarding British rule, hastened its end. Britain's failure in Palestine was also due in part to the lack of rapport between the typical British colonial official and men of words. The majority of the Palestinian Jews, although steeped in action, are by upbringing and tradition men of words, and thin-skinned to a fault. They smarted under the contemptuous attitude of the British official who looked on the Jews as on a pack of unmanly and ungrateful quibblers, an easy prey for the warlike Arabs once Britain withdrew its protective hand. The Palestinian Jews also resented the tutelage of mediocre officials. They're inferiors in both experience and intelligence. Britons of the caliber of Julian Huxley, Harold Nicholson, or Richard Crossman just possibly might have saved Palestine for the empire. In both the Bolshevik and the Nazi regimes, there is evident an acute awareness of the fateful relation between men of words and the state. In Russia, men of letters, artists, and scholars share their privileges of the ruling group. They are all superior civil servants. And though made to toe the party line, they are but subject to the same discipline imposed on the rest of the elite. In the case of Hitler, there was a diabolical realism in his plan to make all learning the monopoly of the elite, which was to rule his envisioned world empire and keep the anonymous masses barely literate. Section 107. The men of letters of 18th century France are the most familiar example of intellectuals pioneering a mass movement. A somewhat similar pattern may be detected in the periods preceding the rise of most movements. The ground for the Reformation was prepared by the men who satirized and denounced the clergy in popular pamphlets, and by men of letters like Johann Reuchlin, who fought and discredited the Roman Curia. The rapid spread of Christianity in the Roman world was partly due to the fact that the pagan cults it sought to supplant were already thoroughly discredited. The discrediting was done before and after the birth of Christianity by the Greek philosophers, who were bored with the puerility of the cults and denounced and ridiculed them in schools and city streets. Christianity made little headway against Judaism because the Jewish religion had the ardent allegiance of the Jewish men of words. The rabbis and their disciples enjoyed an exalted status in the Jewish life of that day, and the book supplanted the temple and the fatherland. In any social order where the reign of men of words is so supreme, no opposition can develop within, and no foreign mass movement can gain a foothold. The mass movements of modern time, whether socialist or nationalist, were invariably pioneered by poets, writers, historians, scholars, philosophers, and the like. The connection between intellectual theoreticians and revolutionary movements needs no emphasis, but it is equally true that all nationalist movements, from the cult of La Patrie in revolutionary France to the latest nationalist rising in Indonesia, were conceived not by men of action, but by fault-finding intellectuals. The generals, industrialists, landowners, and businessmen, who are considered pillars of patriotism, are latecomers who joined the movement after it has become a going concern. The most strenuous effort of the early phase of every nationalist movement consists in convincing and winning over these future pillars of patriotism. The Czech historian Palacký said that if the ceiling of a room in which he and a handful of friends were dining one night had collapsed, there would have been no Czech nationalist movement. Such handfuls of impractical men of words were at the beginning of all nationalist movements. German intellectuals were the originators of German nationalism, just as Jewish intellectuals were the originators of Zionism. It is the deep-seated craving of the man of words for an exalted status which makes him oversensitive to any humiliation imposed on the class or community, racial, lingual, or religious, to which he belongs, however loosely. It was Napoleon's humiliation of the Germans, particularly the Prussians, which drove Fichte, the German intellectuals, to call on the German masses to unite into a mighty nation which would dominate Europe. Theodor Herzl and the Jewish intellectuals were driven to Zionism by the humiliations heaped upon millions of Jews in Russia, and by the calumnies to which the Jews in the rest of continental Europe were subjected toward the end of the 19th century. To a degree, the nationalist movement which forced the British rulers out of India had its inception in the humiliation of a scrawny and bespectacled Indian man of words in South Africa. Section 108. It is easy to see how the fault-finding man of words, by persistent ridicule and denunciation, shakes prevailing beliefs and loyalties and familiarizes the masses with the idea of change. What is not so obvious is the process by which the discrediting of existing beliefs and institutions makes possible the rise of a new fanatical faith. For it is a remarkable fact that the militant man of words, who sounds the established order to its source to mark its want of authority and justice, often prepares the ground not for a society of free-thinking individuals, but for a corporate society that cherishes utmost unity and blind faith. A wide diffusion of doubt and irreverence thus leads often to unexpected results. The irreverence of the Renaissance was a prelude to the new fanaticism of Reformation and Counter-Reformation. The Frenchmen of the Enlightenment who debunked the church and the crown and preached reason and tolerance released a burst of revolutionary and nationalist fanaticism, which has not abated yet. Marx and his followers discredited religion, nationalism, and the passionate pursuit of business and brought into being the new fanaticism of socialism, communism, Stalinist nationalism, and the passion for world dominion. While we debunk a fanatical faith or prejudice, we do not strike at the root of fanaticism. We merely prevent its leaking out at a certain point, with the likely result it will leak out at some other point. Thus, by denigrating prevailing beliefs and loyalties, the militant man of words unwittingly creates in the disillusioned masses a hunger for faith. For the majority of people cannot endure the barrenness and futility of their lives unless they have some ardent dedication or some passionate pursuit in which they can lose themselves. Thus, in spite of himself, the scoffing man of words becomes the precursor of a new faith. The genuine man of words himself can get along without faith in absolutes. He values the search for truth as much as truth itself. He delights in the clash of thought and the give and take of controversy. If he formulates a philosophy and a doctrine, they are more an exhibition of brilliance and an exercise in dialectics than a program of action and the tenets of a faith. His vanity, it is true, often prompts him to defend his speculations with savagery and even venom, but his appeal is usually to reason and not to faith. The fanatics and the faith-hungry masses, however, are likely to invest such speculations with the certitude of Holy Writ and make them the fountainhead of a new faith. Jesus was not a Christian, nor was Marx a Marxist. To sum up, the militant man of words prepares the ground for the rise of a mass movement, 1. By discrediting prevailing creeds and institutions and detaching from them the allegiance of the people. 2. By indirectly creating a hunger for faith in the hearts of those who cannot live without it, so that when the new faith is preached, it finds an eager response among the disillusioned masses. 3. By furnishing the doctrine and the slogans of the new faith. 4. By undermining the convictions of the better people, those who can get along without faith, so that when the new fanaticism makes its appearance, they are without the capacity to resist it. They see no sense in dying for convictions and principles and yield to the new order without a fight. Thus, when the irreverent intellectual has done his work, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The stage is now set for the fanatics. 109. The tragic figures in the history of a mass movement are often the intellectual precursors who live long enough to see the downfall of the old order by the action of the masses. The impression that mass movements, and revolutions in particular, are born of the resolve of the masses to overthrow a corrupt and oppressive tyranny and win for themselves freedom of action, speech, and conscience, has its origin in the din of words let loose by the intellectual originators of the movement in their skirmishes with the prevailing order. The fact that mass movements as they arise often manifest less individual freedom than the order they supplant is usually ascribed to the trickery of a power-hungry clique that kidnaps the movement at a critical stage and cheats the masses of the freedom about to dawn. Actually, the only people cheated in the process are the intellectual precursors. They rise against the established order, derail its irrationality and incompetence, denounce its illegitimacy and oppressiveness, and call for freedom of self-expression and self-realization. They take it for granted that the masses who respond to their call and range themselves behind them crave the same things. However, the freedom the masses crave is not freedom of self-expression and self-realization, but freedom from the intolerable burden of an autonomous existence. They want freedom from the fearful burden of free choice, freedom from the arduous responsibility of realizing their ineffectual selves and shouldering the blame for the blemished product. They do not want freedom of conscience, but faith. Blind, authoritarian faith. They sweep away the old order, not to establish and create a society of free and independent men, but to establish uniformity, individual anonymity, and a new structure of perfect unity. It is not the wickedness of the old regime they rise against, but its weakness, not its oppression, but its failure to hammer them together into one solid, mighty whole. The persuasiveness of the intellectual demagogue consists not so much in convicting people of the vileness of the established order as in demonstrating its helpless incompetence. The immediate result of a mass movement usually corresponds to what the people want. They are not cheated in the process. The reason for the tragic fate which almost always overtakes the intellectual midwives of a mass movement is that no matter how much they preach and glorify the united effort, they remain essentially individualists. They believe in the possibility of individual happiness and the validity of individual opinion and initiative. But once a movement gets rolling, power falls into the hands of those who have neither faith in nor respect for the individual. And the reason they prevail is not so much that their disregard of the individual gives them a capacity for ruthlessness, but that their attitude is in full accord with the ruling passion of the masses.